The white wall of snow hit her so hard that Clara Anderson couldn't tell up from down, and in that moment of pure terror, she knew she was going to die alone in the Colorado wilderness. The wind screamed like a living thing, tearing at her coat and numbing her fingers through her gloves as she stumbled forward through drifts that came up to her knees. She had been traveling from Denver to meet her aunt in Leadville, taking what the stagecoach driver had assured her was a shortcut through the mountain pass. Then the axle had broken. The driver had cursed and told the passengers to wait while he went for help, and she had foolishly thought she could make it to the mining camp she had seen marked on his map just a mile back. That had been over an hour ago, and now she had no idea which direction she was going. The world had become nothing but swirling white, the cold seeping through every layer of clothing until her teeth chattered so violently she bit her tongue. Blood mixed with the snowflakes on her lips. She was 20 years old, and she was going to freeze to death in the blizzard of 1885 without ever having really lived. Her foot caught on something buried beneath the snow, and she went down hard, her hands plunging into the icy powder. She tried to push herself up, but her arms were shaking too badly. The wind shrieked overhead, and she felt the temptation to simply lie there to let the cold take her into sleep. Then she heard it, a voice, rough and urgent, cutting through the storm. "Madam, can you hear me?" She lifted her head, squinting against the assault of snow and ice. A dark shape materialized from the white, and then strong hands were gripping her arms, pulling her to her feet. "I've got you," the voice said, and she found herself staring into a face weathered by sun and wind, with gray-blue eyes that seemed to see straight through the blizzard. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a frost-covered hat pulled low and a bandana wrapped around the lower half of his face. "Can you walk?" "I don't know," she managed through chattering teeth. "You're going to have to try. My horse is just over there, but we need to move fast. This storm is only getting worse." He kept one arm wrapped firmly around her waist as he half carried, half dragged her through the snow. She could barely feel her feet anymore, and her vision was starting to blur at the edges. The world tilted and spun, but the cowboy's grip never loosened. A massive shape loomed out of the whiteness, and she realized it was a horse, a sturdy bay standing with its head lowered against the wind. The cowboy lifted her into the saddle with surprising gentleness, then swung up behind her. His arms came around her as he gathered the reins, and suddenly she was pressed back against his chest, sheltered somewhat from the brutal wind. "Hold on to the saddle horn," he said close to her ear. "We've got about 10 minutes of hard riding. You stay with me, you hear?" She nodded, her frozen fingers fumbling for the horn. The horse lurched into motion, and she would have fallen if not for the solid presence at her back. The cowboy kept up a steady stream of words as they rode, his voice a lifeline in the chaos of the storm. "Name's Franklin Everett," he said. "I've got a line cabin not far from here. Use it when I'm checking the winter range. Small, but it's got a stove and firewood, and it'll keep us alive until this blows through." "Clara," she whispered. "Clara Anderson." "Well, Miss Anderson, you picked a hell of a day for a walk. What were you doing out here?" She tried to explain about the stagecoach, about the broken axle and her foolish decision to set out on her own, but her words came out jumbled and disjointed. The cold had worked its way so deep into her bones that she couldn't think straight anymore. She felt herself starting to slump forward. "No, you don't," Franklin said sharply, his arm tightening around her middle. "You stay awake, talk to me, tell me about Denver, tell me anything." "So cold," she mumbled. "I know, but we're almost there. You see that darker shadow ahead? That's the cabin. Just another minute now." The horse plunged forward, and suddenly they were in the lee of a small structure. The wind's fury diminished to a mere howl. Franklin dismounted in one fluid motion and pulled Clara down after him. Her legs buckled immediately, but he caught her, scooping her up in his arms as if she weighed nothing at all. "Get the door," he told her, but her hands wouldn't cooperate. He shifted her weight, managed to work the latch one-handed, and then they were inside and the roar of the storm became muffled and distant. He set her down on a rough wooden bunk covered with wool blankets, then moved quickly around the small space. She heard the scrape of metal, the scratch of a match, and then blessed warmth began to bloom from the pot-bellied stove in the corner. Franklin worked with efficient speed, feeding kindling and then larger pieces of wood into the flames until the fire was crackling steadily. Only then did he turn his attention back to her. He pulled off his gloves and hat, revealing dark hair silvered at the temples and a face that might have been handsome if not for the grim set of his jaw. He looked to be in his early 30s, with the lean, hard-muscled build of a man who spent his life working outdoors. "We need to get you out of these wet clothes," he said, all business. "You're showing signs of frostbite, and if we don't warm you up properly, you could lose fingers or toes." Clara tried to protest, tried to say something about propriety and decency, but her teeth were chattering too hard to form words. Franklin ignored her feeble attempts to push his hands away as he began unbuttoning her coat with brisk efficiency. "I'm a ranch hand, madam, not a gentleman," he said, not unkindly. "But I'm also not interested in anything except keeping you alive. You can be embarrassed about it later when you've still got all your extremities." He stripped off her sodden coat and dress with the same matter-of-fact competence he might use to doctor a sick calf, leaving her in her cotton chemise and drawers. Then he wrapped her in every blanket he could find and settled her close to the stove, rubbing her hands and feet between his own calloused palms to restore circulation. The pain as feeling returned to her frozen limbs was excruciating. Clara gasped and bit back a cry, tears streaming down her face. "I know it hurts," Franklin said quietly, "but pain means the tissue's still alive. That's good. Just breathe through it." He kept working, methodical and patient, until the worst of the burning ache had subsided to a dull throb. Only then did he tend to his horse, bringing the animal into the small attached shed and rubbing it down before giving it grain from a barrel stored there. When he came back inside, he was carrying saddlebags which he set on the rough table. "Got some dried beef and hardtack," he said. "And coffee if you can stomach it." "Thank you," Clara managed. Her voice sounded thin and shaky even to her own ears. "You saved my life." Franklin shrugged as he hung her wet clothes near the stove to dry. "Anyone would have done the same. But you're the one who found me." "How did you even know I was out there?" "Saw you from the ridge when the storm first started rolling in. Watched you leave that broken-down stage and head off in the wrong direction. By the time I got my gear together and came after you, the visibility had gone to hell." He poured water from a canteen into a battered coffee pot and set it on the stove. "You were lucky. Another 10 minutes and I'd have lost your trail completely." Clara pulled the blankets tighter around herself, watching him move around the small cabin with easy familiarity. Everything about him spoke of competence and self-sufficiency, from the way he measured out the coffee grounds to the practiced efficiency with which he arranged their meager supplies. She found herself studying his face in the firelight, noting the deep creases at the corners of his eyes, the stern line of his mouth, the shadow of stubble along his jaw. "You live out here?" she asked. "Sometimes. I work for the Double Bar Ranch, run cattle in the high country during summer, and check on them through winter when I can. Owner's got several of these lined shacks scattered across the range." He glanced at her. "Not much by way of creature comforts, but it beats freezing to death." "I won't argue with that. The coffee began to boil and Franklin poured it into 2 tin cups, handing one to her. She wrapped her hands around it gratefully, letting the heat seep into her still-chilled fingers. The first sip was bitter and strong enough to make her wince, but it was also the best thing she had ever tasted. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the storm rage outside. The cabin walls creaked and groaned under the assault of the wind, and snow hissed against the single small window. Inside, though, the fire pushed back the cold and the lamplight created a small pocket of warmth and safety in the midst of the blizzard's fury. "So what's in Leadville?" Franklin asked eventually. "My aunt. She runs a boarding house there. My parents passed last year, and I've been living with my brother in Denver, but he just got married, and his new wife made it clear there wasn't room for me anymore." Clara heard the bitterness creeping into her voice and tried to tamp it down. "My aunt offered me a position helping her run the boarding house. It's honest work and a place to call my own." Franklin nodded slowly. "Leadville's a rough town. Silver boom brought in every kind of fortune seeker and outlaw you can imagine. Your aunt must be a tough woman to run a business there." "She is. She was married to a miner who struck it rich, but he died in a cave in 5 years back. She took his money and bought the boarding house, and from what I hear, she doesn't take nonsense from anyone." "Sounds like you come from strong stock, then." Franklin pulled out the dried beef and hardtack, offering her some. "You're going to need that strength. What you did today walking out into that storm was foolish, but you kept going even when you were half frozen. A lot of people would have just laid down and died." Clara took the food, chewing slowly. "I was about to do exactly that when you found me. I don't think I had more than another minute or two left in me. But you didn't give up. That's what matters." She looked at him curiously. "You talk like someone who's been in tight spots before." "More than my share." Franklin's expression grew distant. "I was a scout for the army during the Indian campaigns, back before I realized I was on the wrong side of things. Saw a lot of good people die, both soldiers and natives. When my enlistment was up, I headed for Colorado and took work that didn't involve killing anyone." There was a weight to his words that spoke of old wounds and regrets. Clara found herself wanting to know more, to understand what had put that haunted look in his eyes, but she also recognized that some stories weren't meant to be told to strangers. Not yet, anyway. The storm showed no signs of letting up as evening turned to night. Franklin rationed out their supplies carefully, explaining that they might be stuck for a day or two depending on how much snow fell. He fashioned a privacy curtain from a spare blanket, stringing it across one corner of the cabin so Clara would have a space to herself. "You take the bunk," he said. "I'll make do with my bedroll on the floor." "That doesn't seem fair. This is your cabin. And you're the one who nearly froze to death a few hours ago. Don't argue with me, Miss Anderson. I'm not going to change my mind." There was something almost gentle in the gruff way he spoke, and Clara felt a flutter of warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the stove. She settled onto the bunk, still wrapped in blankets, and watched as Franklin spread his bedroll on the floor and stretched out with a grunt. He kept his gun belt within easy reach, she noticed, and even lying down he seemed alert and watchful. "You think anyone's looking for me?" she asked into the darkness. "The stage driver or the other passengers? Not in this storm. They'd be fools to try. But once it clears, there'll be search parties out. Your best bet is to wait here with me until it's safe to travel, then I'll take you into Saint Elmo. It's closer than Leadville and they've got a telegraph office. You can wire your aunt, let her know you're alive. Saint Elmo. I've heard of it. Mining town, isn't it?" "Was. The silver's mostly played out now and a lot of folks have moved on. But there's still a few hundred people there, enough to support a general store and a saloon and a church." Franklin shifted on his bedroll. "Good people for the most part." They'll help you get to Leadville once the pass clears. Clara lay back on the bunk, staring up at the rough wooden ceiling. The reality of her situation was starting to sink in. She was alone in a tiny cabin with a strange man, miles from anywhere, with a blizzard raging outside. By all rights, she should be terrified, but instead she felt oddly safe, cocooned in warmth and protected by Franklin's solid presence. "Why were you watching the road?" she asked suddenly. "You said you saw me leave the stagecoach from the ridge. What were you doing up there in the middle of a storm?" There was a long pause. "Checking trap lines," Franklin said finally. "Got a few sets out for wolves that have been harassing the cattle. I was on my way back when I spotted your stage." Something in his tone suggested there was more to it than that, but Clara was too exhausted to press. Her eyelids were growing heavy, the warmth and the food and the emotional toll of the day combining to drag her down toward sleep. "Thank you," she murmured, "for everything." "Get some rest, Miss Anderson." She drifted off to the sound of the wind howling outside and the steady crackle of the fire, and for the first time since her parents had died, she felt like maybe everything was going to be all right. Clara woke to pale gray light filtering through the window and the smell of coffee brewing. For a moment she was disoriented, unsure where she was or why her entire body ached. Then memory flooded back and she sat up quickly, clutching the blankets to her chest. Franklin was already up, feeding wood into the stove. He glanced over his shoulder at her. "Morning. Storm's still going, but it's not as fierce as last night. We'll be here another day at least." "Is there enough food?" "Enough. We won't be comfortable, but we won't starve." He poured coffee and brought it to her, careful not to look directly at her state of undress. "Your clothes are dry. You can get dressed behind the curtain." Clara took the coffee gratefully and retreated behind the makeshift privacy screen. Her dress was stiff from the heat of the fire but blessedly dry, and she dressed quickly, fingers fumbling with the buttons. When she emerged, Franklin had laid out a breakfast of more dried beef and some cornmeal mush he'd made with melted snow water. They ate in companionable silence, and Clara found herself stealing glances at her rescuer. In the cold light of day, he looked older than she'd first thought, with deep lines carved around his mouth and a weariness in his eyes that spoke of too many hard years. But there was also a quiet strength about him, a steadiness that she found deeply appealing. "Tell me about the ranch you work for," she said, wanting to hear his voice. Franklin leaned back against the wall, cradling his coffee cup. "The double bar belongs to a man named Harrison Wright. Good boss, fair wages, doesn't work his men into the ground. He's got about 2,000 head of cattle spread across these mountains, and it takes a dozen riders to keep track of them all. In summer, we're up in the high meadows where the grass is sweet. Come fall, we drive them down to the winter range, and then through the cold months we ride circuit, checking on them, breaking ice on water holes, pulling stragglers out of snowdrifts. Sounds like hard work. It is, but it's honest, and I like being out here. No crowds, no noise, just the mountains and the sky and the cattle." He looked at her thoughtfully. "What about you? What did you do in Denver before your sister-in-law decided she didn't want you around?" Clara felt a pang at the reminder of her changed circumstances. "I kept house for my brother. Cooked, cleaned, mended. The sorts of things women are supposed to be good at. Before that, when my parents were alive, I helped my mother with her sewing business. She was a seamstress, very skilled. She taught me everything she knew. That's a valuable trade. You could probably find work in Leadville doing alterations and such if the boarding house doesn't work out." "Maybe." Clara traced the rim of her coffee cup with one finger. "Mostly, I just want a place where I'm wanted, where I'm not just an extra mouth to feed or a burden to be tolerated." "Is that too much to ask?" Franklin's expression softened. No, madam, that's not too much at all. Everyone deserves that. The day passed slowly. The storm continued to rage outside, though with less intensity than the night before. Franklin occupied himself with small tasks, mending a piece of tack, sharpening his knife, checking and rechecking their supplies. Clara watched him work, noting the economy of his movements, the way his hands moved with practiced skill. To pass the time, they talked. Clara told him about growing up in Denver, about her father who had been a clerk and her mother who had turned her sewing skills into a modest income that supplemented the family's finances. She spoke about her brother's courtship and marriage, about how his new wife had viewed Clara as competition rather than family. Franklin, in turn, opened up in small increments. He'd grown up on a farm in Missouri, the youngest of 6 children. When the war came, he'd been too young to fight, but afterward he'd joined the army looking for adventure and steady pay. He spoke little of his time as a scout, but Clara could read between the lines and sense the guilt he carried over things he'd seen and done. "Why cattle ranching?" she asked. "After the army, you could have done anything. Needed something as far from soldiering as I could get, needed space to breathe and time to forget." He looked at her directly. "And I suppose I needed to feel like I was building something instead of tearing it down. When you're working cattle, you're part of the cycle of life. You're creating food, supporting families. It's simple work, but it's clean." There was such naked honesty in his words that Clara felt her throat tighten. "I think I understand that. Wanting to build something, I mean. That's part of why I'm going to Leadville, to create a life that's mine, not just the leftover pieces of someone else's." Franklin nodded slowly. "Then we're not so different, you and I." As afternoon faded into evening, the storm began to break. The wind died down and the snow became intermittent, falling in soft flurries rather than blinding sheets. Franklin ventured outside to check on his horse and came back stamping snow from his boots. "Should be clear enough to travel by morning," he reported. "We'll head down to Saint Elmo, get you sorted out with the telegraph office and a proper place to stay." Clara should have been relieved. Instead, she felt an unexpected pang of disappointment. The thought of leaving this small cabin, of saying goodbye to Franklin and continuing on to Leadville alone, suddenly seemed unbearable. In just one day and night, she had grown accustomed to his presence, to his quiet competence and understated kindness. "I suppose I should thank you properly," she said, trying to keep her voice light. "You've been very generous with your time and supplies." "No thanks necessary. I did what anyone would do." "Not anyone. A lot of men would have left me to freeze, or worse, would have taken advantage of the situation." Clara felt her cheeks heat but forced herself to continue. "You've been nothing but respectful and decent. That's rarer than you might think." Franklin looked uncomfortable with the praise. "I'm just doing what's right, Miss Anderson. Clara, please call me Clara. I think we can dispense with formality after spending a day trapped in a cabin together." A faint smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Clara, then, and you can call me Franklin or Frank if you prefer." "Franklin suits you better, I think." That night they shared the last of the coffee and talked until the fire burned low. Clara found herself telling him things she'd never told anyone, about her fear of ending up alone, about her anger at her brother's betrayal, about her determination to make something of herself, despite the limitations society placed on women without means or connections. Franklin listened without judgment, occasionally offering a quiet comment or question, and when she asked him about his own fears and hopes, he surprised her by answering with the same openness she'd shown him. "I'm 32 years old," he said. "I've spent the last decade moving from place to place, never putting down roots, never letting anyone get close. Told myself it was because I liked the freedom, but truth is I've been running. From the memories, from the guilt, from the man I was during the war. And now I'm starting to think maybe it's time to stop running. Wrights offered me a position as ranch foreman. It'd mean staying in one place, taking on responsibility, becoming part of a community. I've been sitting on the decision for months, too scared to commit. Clara leaned forward. What are you scared of? That I'll fail? That I'm not the kind of man who deserves a settled life after the things I've done? Franklin's voice was rough with emotion. That if I let myself care about something, about people, it'll just get taken away like everything else. Without thinking, Clara reached out and took his hand. His fingers were calloused and warm, and they closed carefully around hers. Everyone deserves a chance to start over, she said softly. Everyone deserves to build something good out of the ashes of what came before. Franklin looked down at their joined hands, then up at her face. The lamplight caught in his eyes, turning them silver blue, and Clara felt her breath catch in her throat. The air between them seemed to thicken, charged with an awareness that made her pulse quicken. "Clara," he said, and her name on his lips sounded like a prayer. Then he was leaning toward her, and she was meeting him halfway, and their lips came together in a kiss that was gentle and searching and filled with all the words they hadn't yet found the courage to speak. Clara's free hand came up to rest against his chest, feeling the steady thump of his heart beneath her palm. Franklin cupped her face with his other hand, his touch reverent, as if she were something precious and fragile. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Clara saw her own wonder reflected in Franklin's eyes. "I didn't plan that," he said hoarsely. "I swear I didn't bring you here with any intentions, I know." Clara pressed her fingers to his lips, silencing him. "I know what kind of man you are, Franklin Everett, and that's exactly why I wanted you to kiss me. We've known each other barely a day. I know, it's madness, but I've never felt safer or more seen than I have in this cabin with you." She took a shaky breath. "Maybe that's what happens when someone saves your life. Maybe when you face death together, it strips away all the pretense and lets you see each other clearly." Franklin pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her, and Clara rested her head against his shoulder. They stayed like that for a long time, holding each other while the fire crackled, and the last of the storm whispered itself to silence outside. When they finally separated to sleep, Clara on the bunk and Franklin on his bedroll, she lay awake for hours, her lips still tingling from his kiss, her heart full of a wild, improbable hope. The morning dawned clear and brutally cold, the sky a hard, brilliant blue above a world transformed by snow. Franklin woke Clara before first light, and they prepared quickly, packing up the supplies and making the cabin ready to be closed up again. Outside, the snowdrifts were waist-deep in places, sparkling like scattered diamonds in the early light. Franklin saddled his horse and helped Clara mount, then swung up behind her just as he had when he'd rescued her from the storm. But this time, when his arms came around her to take the reins, Clara leaned back against him with a sense of belonging that made her chest ache. The ride down the mountain to Saint Elmo took most of the morning. Franklin kept the horse to a careful walk, picking his way around the worst of the drifts and staying to the tree line where the snow wasn't as deep. They passed the abandoned stagecoach along the way, half buried in snow, and Clara shuddered to think how close she'd come to dying there. Saint Elmo appeared as they rounded a bend in the trail, a cluster of weathered buildings nestled in a narrow valley. Smoke rose from several chimneys, and Clara could see people moving about on the main street, digging out from the storm. Franklin guided his horse toward a building with a sign that read Carson's General Store and Post Office. He dismounted and helped Clara down, his hands lingering at her waist for just a moment longer than necessary. Inside, a portly man with impressive mutton chops looked up from sweeping the floor. "Franklin, Good to see you made it through the storm. We were starting to worry about you boys up in the high country." "I'm fine, Mr. Carson, but this lady needs to send a telegram." She was on the Denver stage when it broke down, got caught in the blizzard. Carson's eyes widened. "The whole town's been talking about that stage. The driver made it here yesterday afternoon, half frozen. Said he had passengers, but he got separated from them in the storm. Everyone figured they were dead." "Nearly was," Clara said. "If Franklin hadn't found me, I wouldn't have lasted another 10 minutes. Carson shook his head in amazement. "You're a lucky woman, miss. Come on, I'll get the telegraph key warmed up. Who do you need to contact?" Clara sent a telegram to her aunt in Leadville, explaining what had happened and asking for instructions. Then, at Carson's insistence, she sent another to her brother in Denver, letting him know she was safe. Franklin stood quietly beside her the whole time, a steady presence at her back. When it was done, Carson offered them coffee and fresh bread, and they sat in the back of the store while he regaled them with news from town. The storm had taken down a few roofs, and there'd been some livestock losses, but overall Saint Elmo had weathered it well. "You'll want to stay at the boarding house while you wait for replies," Carson told Clara. "Mrs. Murphy runs a clean place and her rates are fair. It's just down the street, the blue building with the white trim." "I'll take her over," Franklin said. They walked through the snowy streets side by side, neither speaking. Clara was intensely aware of how close Franklin was, how their hands almost but not quite brushed as they walked. When they reached the boarding house, she turned to face him, suddenly desperate not to let him go. "Will I see you again?" she asked, not caring how forward it sounded. Franklin's jaw tightened. "I have to get back to the ranch, check on the cattle. But Clara, he stopped, seeming to struggle for words. "What happened in that cabin, that wasn't just because of the storm or the danger. At least not for me. Not for me either. Then I'll come back. Soon as I can, I'll come back to Saint Elmo, and if you're still here, if you haven't already gone on to Leadville, maybe we could." "Yes," Clara said quickly. "Whatever you're about to suggest, yes." Franklin's face broke into a genuine smile, the first she'd seen from him, and it transformed him from merely handsome to heartbreakingly beautiful. "I was going to say maybe we could have dinner. Get to know each other properly, without the threat of freezing to death hanging over us." "I'd like that very much." He reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering against her cheek. "I'll be back in 3 days. 4 at the most. Wait for me. I'll wait." He kissed her then, right there on the street where anyone could see, a long, sweet kiss that tasted of promise and new beginnings. When he pulled away, Clara had to grab the porch railing to steady herself. Franklin tipped his hat to her, his eyes warm with emotion, then turned and walked back toward Carson's store where his horse was tied. Clara watched him go, her heart hammering in her chest, hardly able to believe that any of this was real. Mrs. Murphy's boarding house was indeed clean and comfortable, and the proprietor was a motherly woman who clucked over Clara's story and insisted on serving her a hot meal despite it being well past lunchtime. Clara ate mechanically, her mind still back in that cabin on the mountain, reliving every moment she'd spent with Franklin. The reply from her aunt came the next morning. Aunt Margaret was relieved Clara was safe and urged her to stay in Saint Elmo until the pass to Leadville was completely clear. She would send someone to fetch Clara in a week or so, once the roads were passable for wagons. A week. Clara felt a surge of guilty relief. A week gave her time. Time to see Franklin again. Time to figure out if what she felt was real or just the product of heightened emotion and extraordinary circumstances. She spent the next 2 days helping Mrs. Murphy around the boarding house, grateful for work to keep her hands busy even if it couldn't quiet her racing thoughts. The town was slowly digging itself out from the storm, and Clara volunteered to help where she could, mending torn clothing for miners and cooking meals for families whose supplies had been damaged by collapsed roofs. On the third day, Franklin returned. Clara was hanging laundry in the side yard when she heard his voice asking Mrs. Murphy if Miss Anderson was available. She dropped the sheet she'd been pinning and ran around to the front of the house, not caring how undignified it looked. Franklin stood on the porch, hat in hand, looking tired and windburned and absolutely wonderful. When he saw her, his whole face lit up. "You waited," he said. "I told you I would." He came down the steps to meet her, and suddenly Clara was in his arms and he was lifting her off her feet, spinning her around while she laughed with pure joy. When he set her down, they were both grinning like fools. "I've been thinking about you every minute," Franklin said. "Couldn't concentrate on work, nearly lost track of a whole section of cattle because I was daydreaming. Wright threatened to dock my pay if I didn't get my head straight. I've been just as bad. Mrs. Murphy caught me putting salt in the sugar bowl this morning because I wasn't paying attention. Have dinner with me tonight. There's a restaurant here, nothing fancy, but the food's good and they've got a private dining room. Let me court you properly, Clara. Let me do this right." "Yes," she breathed. "Yes to all of it." That evening, Clara wore her best dress, the dark green wool that brought out her eyes. Franklin arrived promptly at 6, freshly shaved and wearing a clean shirt, and offered her his arm like a proper gentleman. They walked to the restaurant through streets turned golden by the setting sun, and Clara felt like she was floating. The private dining room was small and intimate, with a window overlooking the mountains. They sat across from each other at a table covered with a red checked cloth, and for the first time since they'd met, they had all the time in the world and no storm threatening to tear them apart. Over roast chicken and potatoes, they talked about everything and nothing. Franklin told her about the Double Bar Ranch in more detail, about the other cowboys who worked there, and the rhythm of ranch life through the seasons. Clara spoke about her dreams of one day having her own dressmaking shop, about designs she'd sketched, and fabrics she'd admired in Denver store windows. "You could do that here," Franklin said suddenly. "Saint Elmo doesn't have a seamstress. The women have to order everything from catalogs or make do with what Carson stocks at the general store. If you opened a shop, you'd have more business than you could handle." Clara felt a flutter of excitement. "But what about Leadville? My aunt is expecting me. Write to her. Explain the situation. You said yourself she's a tough, independent woman. She'll understand if you want to make your own way instead of working for her." "The situation," Clara repeated softly. "And what situation is that exactly, Franklin?" He reached across the table and took her hand. "The situation where I'm falling in love with you, and I don't want you to go to Leadville or anywhere else that takes you away from me." Clara's breath caught. It was too soon, too fast, too improbable. And yet it was also the truest thing she'd ever heard. "I'm falling in love with you too," she whispered. "I know it's mad and I should probably have my head examined, but I can't help it. When I'm with you, everything makes sense in a way it never has before." Franklin stood and came around the table, pulling her to her feet. He kissed her with a passion that made her toes curl, his hands tangling in her hair, and Clara kissed him back with everything in her, every hope and dream and desperate longing pouring into that single, perfect moment. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Franklin rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me," he said. "I know it's fast and I don't have much to offer except a ranch hand's wages and a heart that's been yours since the moment I pulled you out of that snowdrift. But marry me, Clara. Build a life with me. Let me spend every day for the rest of my life making you happy." Tears streamed down Clara's face, but she was smiling so wide her cheeks ached. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Franklin, I'll marry you. I'll marry you and build a life with you and be happy with you. And I don't care that it's fast or improbable because it's also right. It's the rightest thing I've ever felt." They were married 2 weeks later in Saint Elmo's small church, with half the town in attendance. Mrs. Murphy stood up as Clara's witness, tears streaming down her plump cheeks, while Mr. Wright, Franklin's boss, served as his. Clara wore a dress she'd made herself in record time, a simple cream-colored wool with lace at the collar and cuffs, and Franklin wore his Sunday best and looked at her like she'd hung the moon. The ceremony was brief but heartfelt, and when the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Franklin kissed her with such tenderness that Clara felt her heart might burst from sheer happiness. The whole town celebrated with them afterward, and Carson donated a keg of beer while Mrs. Murphy provided a massive wedding cake. As the party wound down and evening settled over the mountains, Franklin and Clara slipped away to the small house on the edge of town that Wright had helped Franklin secure. It was modest but sturdy, with 2 rooms and a pot-bellied stove and windows that looked out on the peaks. Franklin carried Clara over the threshold, both of them laughing, and set her down gently in the middle of what was now their home. "Are you happy?" he asked, suddenly uncertain. Clara cupped his face in her hands. "I have never been happier in my entire life. You saved me, Franklin, not just from the blizzard but from a life of being unwanted and overlooked. You saw me, really saw me, and you chose me. I'll choose you every day for the rest of my life," Franklin promised. And then he was kissing her again, and Clara was kissing him back, and the rest of the world fell away until there was nothing but the 2 of them and the promise of all the tomorrows to come. The first year of their marriage was hard in the way of all new beginnings, but it was also filled with more joy than Clara had known possible. She opened her dressmaking shop in a corner of Carson's store, and just as Franklin had predicted, she was soon overwhelmed with orders. The women of Saint Elmo and the surrounding ranches were desperate for someone who could create fashionable clothing and do skilled alterations. Franklin took the position as ranch foreman that Wright had offered, and he threw himself into the work with renewed purpose. Clara loved watching him come home each evening, tired but satisfied, ready to tell her about his day while she cooked their supper and told him about hers. They learned each other slowly, intimately, in the quiet hours of evening and the soft warmth of their bed. Franklin was a gentle, patient lover, always concerned with Clara's comfort and pleasure. And Clara discovered that she had a passionate nature she'd never suspected, a capacity for physical joy that matched the emotional contentment she felt in her husband's arms. In the fall, Clara realized she was pregnant. She told Franklin over dinner one evening, watching nervously for his reaction. He went very still, his fork halfway to his mouth, and for a moment she worried he was upset. Then he set down the fork carefully, came around the table, and gathered her into his arms. "A baby," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "We're going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" Clara asked, echoing his question from their wedding night. Happy doesn't even begin to cover it. Terrified, amazed, grateful, all of those things. But mostly just so full of love I think I might burst. He pressed a kiss to her temple. "You're giving me everything I never thought I deserved. A home, a family, a reason to be better than I was." "You were always better than you thought," Clara told him. "You just needed someone to show you." Their son was born in early summer of 1886, a healthy boy with Franklin's gray-blue eyes and a powerful set of lungs. They named him Matthew, after Franklin's father, and he became the center of their universe. Franklin was besotted with the baby, spending every free moment holding him, talking to him, marveling at his tiny fingers and toes. Clara watched her husband transform into a father and fell even more deeply in love with him. The haunted look that had lurked in Franklin's eyes when they first met was gone now, replaced by contentment and purpose. He was a man at peace with himself, and she was proud to have been part of that transformation. As Matthew grew from baby to toddler, the little house on the edge of Saint Elmo became a true home, filled with laughter and love. Clara's shop continued to thrive, and Franklin's skill as foreman made the Double Bar one of the most successful ranches in the region. They weren't rich, but they were comfortable, and more importantly, they were happy. On their second anniversary, Franklin took Clara back up to the line cabin where he'd saved her life. They left Matthew with Mrs. Murphy for the night and rode up the mountain together on a clear summer day that bore no resemblance to the blizzard that had brought them together. The cabin looked smaller than Clara remembered, but the memories it held were precious. They sat outside watching the sunset paint the peaks in shades of gold and crimson, and Franklin pulled Clara close against his side. "You ever regret it?" he asked quietly. "Choosing this life instead of going to Leadville, instead of all the other things you might have done?" Clara turned to look at him, at this man who had given her everything she'd ever wanted and so much more besides. Not for a single second. "You saved my life that day, Franklin, but what I didn't realize until much later was that I saved yours too. We saved each other." "We did," Franklin agreed. He kissed her softly, sweetly, a kiss that tasted of promise and devotion and forever. "And I'd do it all again in a heartbeat. Walk through 1,000 blizzards if it meant finding you at the end." "No more blizzards," Clara said firmly. "But everything else, all of this, for as long as we live." "For as long as we live," Franklin echoed, and it was a vow more binding than any they'd spoken in the church. They stayed at the cabin that night, making love by lamplight and talking until dawn about their dreams for the future. Clara wanted to expand her shop, maybe take on an apprentice. Franklin was thinking about buying some land, starting his own small ranch someday. And they both wanted more children, brothers and sisters for Matthew. Those dreams came true slowly but surely over the years that followed. A daughter arrived 2 years after Matthew, a sweet-tempered girl they named Emily who had Clara's dark hair and ready smile. Then another son, James, who was quieter than his siblings but fiercely loyal. And finally, another daughter, Sarah, born when Clara was 30 and Franklin was 42, who completed their family perfectly. Clara did expand her shop, eventually taking over an entire building on Main Street. She hired 2 young women from town as apprentices, and taught them everything her mother had taught her about the art of dressmaking. Franklin bought a parcel of land adjacent to the Double Bar and began building his own herd with Wright's blessing and assistance. Through it all, through the good times and the hard times, through illness and health and all the 1,000 small dramas of family life, Clara and Franklin's love remained the bedrock on which everything else was built. They never lost the sense of wonder at having found each other, never took for granted the gift they'd been given. On their 20th anniversary, their children now nearly grown, Franklin surprised Clara with a trip to Denver. They stayed in a fine hotel and ate in fancy restaurants and walked the streets where Clara had grown up. It was strange seeing the city again after so long, but Clara realized she felt no nostalgia for her old life. Saint Elmo was her home now, completely and irrevocably. On their last evening in Denver, they stood on the hotel balcony watching the sun set over the mountains, and Franklin wrapped his arms around Clara from behind, resting his chin on her head. "Thank you," he said softly. "For what?" "For getting lost in that blizzard. For being stubborn enough to walk away from that stagecoach. For waiting for me in Saint Elmo. For saying yes when I asked you to marry me." He turned her in his arms so she faced him. "For choosing me every day for 20 years. Clara reached up and touched his face. now lined with laugh lines and weathered by 2 decades of mountain sun and wind. His hair was more silver than dark now, and there was reading glasses in his shirt pocket that he grumbled about needing. But his eyes were the same gray-blue that had captivated her that first night in the cabin, and they still looked at her with the same love and devotion. "You saved my life," she said, repeating words that had become almost a ritual between them over the years. "In every way a person can be saved." "We saved each other," Franklin replied, giving her the response he always did. Then he kissed her, and Clara kissed him back, and it was just as sweet and perfect as it had been that very first time. They returned to Saint Elmo and to their life there, to their children and their work, and the community they'd become such an integral part of. Matthew had followed his father into ranching, and now ran the small spread Franklin had built. Emily had married a doctor and moved to Leadville, though she visited often. James was away at college in Denver, studying engineering, and Sarah was still at home, helping Clara in the shop and courting the son of a local mine owner. As Clara and Franklin grew older, they became the heart of Saint Elmo, the couple everyone pointed to as proof that true love existed. They were the ones young people came to for advice, the ones who hosted gatherings and mediated disputes and made everyone feel welcome in their home. When Franklin was 55, he was kicked by a horse and broke his leg badly. It healed but left him with a limp, and he reluctantly turned over most of the ranch operations to Matthew. He spent more time in town after that, helping Clara with the shop and spoiling their growing number of grandchildren. Clara didn't mind having him underfoot. In fact, she treasured it. They'd spent so much of their marriage with Franklin out on the range that having him home every day felt like a gift. They fell into new rhythms, working side by side in the shop, taking afternoon walks through town, spending long evenings on their porch watching the sunset paint the mountains. On a summer evening in 1905, 20 years after the blizzard that had brought them together, Clara and Franklin sat on that porch surrounded by their children and grandchildren. Matthew's 3 sons were chasing each other around the yard. Emily's twin daughters were showing Sarah's new baby girl the flowers in Clara's garden. James had brought his new wife home to meet the family. Clara looked at the scene before her, at this sprawling, noisy, beautiful family they'd created, and felt a profound sense of gratitude. She leaned against Franklin's shoulder, and he wrapped his arm around her, the gesture as natural as breathing after 40 years of marriage. "Not bad for a woman who was lost in a blizzard," she murmured. Franklin chuckled, the sound rumbling through his chest. "Not bad at all for a cowboy who happened to be in the right place at the right time." "It wasn't just luck," Clara said. "It was fate. We were meant to find each other." "I believe that." "I believe you were meant to get lost, and I was meant to find you, and everything that came after was meant to be exactly as it was." As the sun sank behind the peaks, and the mountains glowed gold in the fading light, Clara reflected on the journey that had brought her here. If someone had told that frightened, frozen girl stumbling through the snow that she would one day have everything she'd ever dreamed of and more, she never would have believed them. But Franklin had saved her that day, in every sense of the word. He'd given her shelter from the storm, yes, but he'd also given her a home, a family, a purpose, and a love that had sustained her through 4 decades. He'd shown her that she was worthy of being chosen, of being cherished, of being loved with a fierce and enduring devotion. And she had saved him too, had helped him leave behind the ghosts of his past, and become the man he was always meant to be. Together they had built something strong and true, something that would endure long after they were gone, carried on in the hearts of their children and grandchildren, and all the lives they'd touched. As darkness fell and the stars began to emerge overhead, Clara and Franklin remained on their porch, surrounded by their family, wrapped in each other's arms. The blizzard that had nearly killed Clara had instead given her life, real life, the kind of life she'd always dreamed of but never quite believed was possible. She looked up at Franklin's weathered, beloved face and saw him looking back at her with the same wonder and love she felt. After 40 years, he still looked at her like she'd hung the moon. After 40 years, her heart still skipped a beat when he smiled. "I love you," she whispered. "I love you too," Franklin replied. "Always have, always will." And there on the porch of their home in Saint Elmo, with their family around them and the mountains standing eternal watch, Clara and Franklin Everett held each other close and gave thanks for the blizzard that had brought them together and the love that had sustained them through all the years since. Their story, born in a storm and tempered by time, had become the kind of legend that would be told in Saint Elmo for generations to come. A story of rescue and redemption, of courage and devotion, of two people who had found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances and built a love that would last forever.